Welcome to our last class of the semester. Today is just going to be how to write papers part 3. It will probably not take the whole period. And it's also just going to be some business stuff and some have a good summer stuff. So first off, some business things. Outlines. The outline assignment was due today. I will be grading them over tomorrow morning. So get them to me. I'll be assuming that you did it and that you are familiar with what I'm talking about as I'm talking today. But if you haven't had a chance, get that to me by tomorrow morning. I'll be grading them tomorrow morning. Again, they're pass fail, and I will be putting some feedback in the margins on them. So you'll get back basically a PDF with a whole bunch of red writing in it. Excuse me. That gives you some tips about what works, how I think things are structured. And basically, it's just to give you some feedback as you go into the writing part itself. Paper is due a week from today, I believe. Let me just double check that. I always get to like 95% certain and then forget to get to it's more that I know it's due when it's due, but I then get terrified that I'm just gonna say the wrong thing. So let me just quadruple check. So give me 1 second, Nick, to answer your question. And the short answer is yes. It's a crazy time, but yes, let me just double check these things. Critical thinking. Okay, yes. I knew the answer, but I wanted to triple check. All right, end of the day, next Monday, May 24th. I'll say more about this at the end of class as more people arrive, but basically that is going to have to be a hard deadline. Grades are due on the 28th, and I need time to grade your papers and get them back to you. So basically, if anything comes up and you need to turn it in after the 24th, you need to let me know ahead of time. I need to be able to get these things graded. Again, it's COVID, so if something comes up, let me know. But please, please, please get your final work in on the 24th. I will also be sending out an email out about other late work. Basically, for the thesis assignment last week, if you still haven't done it, do it now. I will definitely be giving partial credit for those of you who turn it in late. Also, I will give partial credit for things earlier in the semester. Depending on how early the assignment was due, I will have to take off good amounts of points. If you only turn in the last assignment at the end of the semester, you're about 2.5 months late. But I will definitely take into account that it is COVID and that things have been tough. And I will definitely give some partial credit. And it's better to get partial credit than to get no credit. The next thing I wanted to say was, if you have any questions on any of this stuff, just reach out and let me know. I will be giving feedback on the final papers. The only thing I say, and I'll email you out this point too, if anyone doesn't want feedback, they don't want me to put the time, like they know they're never going to look at any feedback I write. I'm not going to judge you for it. This might well be the last philosophy class you ever take. It might be your last semester. If you just want to get this done and never have to think about it again, write, please don't put any, or I don't need any comments. That way I don't spend a lot of time agonizing over writing you a comment that you never read. So that's just a favor to me. If you don't do it, I'll just assume you want feedback, write it out, and that'll be that. Any questions on the businessy stuff so far? Also, anything we talk about today, this video, like all the others, will be posted. Any business questions thus far? And I'll say them again at the end of class if you think of anything. All right. Well, if the business questions are done, I'm now just going to go through with some general tips about how to turn the outline you have into a full paper. Because basically what you have is you've got a skeleton of a paper. How do you put meat on it? And this is generally going to be the toughest part of paper writing. Coming up with a good thesis, there's a pretty straightforward way of doing that. Coming up with a good outline, it's easy to identify what would work for that and what wouldn't. Once you come into the writing of the rest of the sentences in the paragraph, there's no one right answer. You can do it right, you can do it wrong. There are many ways of doing it right, and there are equally many ways of doing it wrong. And it's just a matter of approaching it in whatever way works for you and gives the reader a good sense of why you think that your thesis is something that they, the reader, should believe as well. So basically what that means practically is today is just going to be a lot of like tips and tricks and hints and things that I often put comments about, other than things like signpost and thesis. If at any point today you have questions about the paper that are either practical or general sorts of things like, I heard about this from another class, or what about this thing, feel free to ask. Also, at the end, I'm going to totally open it up for questions. So if there's anything I haven't covered, be it something as simple as what format do you want this in, feel free to ask those questions as well. All right, any questions thus far? All right, if no questions, the first tip on how to write a paper is, remember, the goal is to write a reasoned defense of some claim. So if you're doing this, the ultimate goal is to prove that your thesis is true. That means to do this well, you don't just tell me true things about the thesis or about things related to the thesis. You need to say enough that any reader would understand what you're saying. So contrast these two sentences. Can everyone see these? Number one has a minus in front of it. The second one has a plus in front of it. Can everyone see these? Are they written clearly enough?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So here would be the difference between something a person might put in a paper that does not work that well, but is true, versus the level of detail that is what would separate an excellent paper from just one which is fine. So imagine this was a paper about like, what is a logic class, or what did you study at the start of the semester, or explain to me why the start of the semester was so important. And one of the things you want to say is you learned the basics of logic or something like that. Well, one thing you could say to a reader who's not necessarily going to know what you're talking about in class, you could say logic looks at arguments. That is true. But the goal is to make sure that your reader knows exactly what it means. So if you just stop here, that would not be enough for any reader to understand the thing you're thinking about. Instead, you need to say enough that the reader would actually be able to understand it. So this is not perfect. I wrote this up before class, but it's the sort of thing I'm talking about. So instead of saying logic looks at argument, what you'd say is something like, logic is the study of the structure of arguments. In particular, logic examines what combinations of true statements allow us to gain knowledge of further truths. I forgot the word truths here. And then you could say, for example, logic would yada yada. Does everyone see the difference here? About the difference between a simple true statement in the paper and this level of detail that would allow anybody to understand it. Think about when you're writing an argumentative paper like this, you are trying to teach your reader why your answer is correct. So you need the level of detail needed that they would be able to learn. Don't just tell them, if in the first prompt, if you're or in the cultural relativism prompt, don't just tell me cultural relativism believes that morality is relative to culture. That's true. But a reader needs to know what exactly that means. If you say that free speech is speech that is free, that's true. But what would a reader need to know to understand what that really means? Does that make sense to everyone? Can I get some affirmative yeses?
Yes.
As long as it's clear. And honestly, a lot of this stuff is just, why I bring this up is it's common sense in a certain way that this is what you're doing, but in the writing process, it can be all too easy to start getting rushed. And so it's useful to remind yourself, like, what am I trying to do? Oh, I need to make this clear enough that anyone could understand. All right. The second tip I want to put up, can I erase tip number one? Are we good here?
Yeah.
Okay. Tip number 2. Use examples and explain them. So one of the best ways to say what you're talking about is to use an example. So what do I mean by an example? What is it to use an example in your writing? In some sense, it's pretty straightforward and obvious, but it's the sort of thing that can be done well or poorly, and in so doing can really make a difference in your paper. So to use an example is basically when you make a general statement, you then give a particular case that illustrates that statement. So for instance, if you say dogs are very loving, you then give an example of a time that illustrates that fact. So you say dogs are very loving. For instance, this morning when I woke up, my pet dog was all cuddled up next to me wanting attention. That would be a way in which you use an example to illustrate the more general point. So in a paper like this, in which you've just, you make a general claim like cultural relativism has some negative consequences. Well, then what you could do is, for instance, it leads to yada yada. An example of how this might occur is that. And so that's what I mean by using examples and explaining them. It's a matter of taking a general claim, then putting it in a simple case that anyone can understand and allows them to see how it shows the more general point. Now, pop quiz, where can your examples come from in a paper like this?
The Baruch Library Database.
Baruch Library Database, yes. Where else?
Newspaper.
Newspaper, where else? The internet, where else?
This class.
This class. There's any one of you could say anything right now and it would be a correct answer. Because when you're giving an example, all that matters is that it illustrates your point. It can also come, one thing is made up. Personal story. You can make things up. You can come up with a personal anecdote. If you're talking about the fact that cultures are different, you can talk about a time that you went somewhere else and found that culture completely different from your own. You can make up a case. So for instance, I don't have a pet dog, but I just gave an example of my pet dog being loving because that illustrated the point. The goal with examples is you use them to illustrate a general point. Where they come from doesn't necessarily matter if you're just using them to illustrate a point. If you're instead trying to use them to prove that something is true, then you're going to want to get them from a reputable source. So for instance, if you're not just using an example to illustrate, but you're instead saying like the United States is the greatest nation in the world. For instance, in the previous election, 95% of people agreed that it's the greatest country in the world. That sort of thing, if it's the statistic like that, you need to get it from a reputable source. And that's where you want to go to good internet sites, encyclopedias. But for a paper like this, I'm not usually going to be asking you to rely on data like that. So the sorts of examples are just things you can come up with, any news story you've read, even a personal anecdote. But if the example is at all confusing or at all substantive, you want to explain why it shows what you say it shows. So for instance, if you're doing the one on cultural relativism and you say, one of the main drivers behind cultural relativism is this idea that people in different cultures have different views. A good example of this comes from my own personal trip to wherever you went on a vacation to. When I got there, people did X, Y, and Z that was different from back home. The final sentence after that brings us into, this should be number 2. Number 3, explain the significance. Say something like, what this example shows is that people from different cultures have very different views. So that's what I mean by explain the significance. When you're writing a paper like this, always assume that your reader is really stupid. Basically assume that I am an absolute idiot. Now, why would you assume that your professor's an absolute idiot? Well, the level of detail that you need to include to fully demonstrate that you understand a topic is the level of detail that you need to even get an absolute idiot to understand what it is you're talking about. So treat me, another way of thinking about it is treat me like a drunken fifth grader. A drunken fifth grader is not going to be the most intelligent person and might not know what you're talking about. So if you could write your paper so that even a drunken 10-year-old would know what you're talking about, that's the level of detail. So this one thing that goes into this is after you say a true thing in a lot of terms, spell out why it's so significant. If you bring up a certain example as a bad consequence for cultural relativism, or one of the negative effects that hate speech can have on a community, don't just say this would be bad. Say this would be bad because it would yada 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 yada. So does everyone see this difference here? When you're writing a paragraph, you want to start off by, in this paragraph, I'm going to discuss why dogs are more friendly than cats. And then you're going to explain what that means. And in so doing, you're also going to explain why all the evidence you give is proof of your claim. Does that make sense to people? Dale?
Yes.
Okay. Any other questions at this point?
So,
And-
Professor, in terms of, you said we can use like made up examples if we really like explained it well. And
Yeah.
in terms of the sources, let's just say we did use a valid source. So would you have to cite it at the end?
So here's what, this was number 9, or no, this was the number 8. So let's just keep on my listing and go with, can I erase this one of use examples and explain the significance? We doing okay? All
Yeah.
right. So you know what, I'll use the numbering that we've actually been going through. Sources and citations. Give me enough that I know you didn't plagiarize, don't care, reformat. So what do I mean by this? Basically, if you want to use outside sources at all, for these papers are not necessarily designed to have to use anything other than the readings for class. You are welcome to do so, but you don't have to. And when you do this, if you use an outside source, first off, you don't need to cite the readings for class. I know what they are. If you're going to use a quote, tell me which reading you got the quote from, but I don't need you to like include a works cited at the end of the readings from class. If you bring in an outside source, basically, I just want to make sure 2 things. 1, you tell me where you got it in enough detail that I can make sure you're not just straight up plagiarizing it. And 2, if I find it interesting, I can go and find it myself. So because of this, I really don't give a damn about the format of them. If you want to go MLA, great. If you want to use, what are the other ones? Chicago footnote style, great. If you want to just include a hyperlink at the bottom of the page and say, got my source from here, great. I just want you to tell me where you got it so I could find it. There are many professors out there who will teach you you have many more opportunities to practice your citations. It's not something that I will look at, so I'm not going to ask you to do it in any particular way. Just if you use an outside source, make sure I could find it using my computer or a library or something like that. Any other questions on citations, anything on that front? Okay, awesome.
I have a question.
Yes, Valerie.
So if we cite and use a bibliography, can that kind of like count as a page?
So that's another good
Is
practice.
that okay?
Yeah, let me explain page limits. Page limits. All right. What's the best way of putting this? Page limits are merely suggestions. So this paper, I believe it said 3 to 5 pages, like 900 to 1500 words. Now, why does it say that? Well, these are merely suggestions. I have given many paper prompts similar to these ones in the past. I, having written them for years, have a general gist about once I write like a prompt, how long will it take the average person to answer that question thoroughly? Usually for these prompts, that the average good paper will fall somewhere between 3 pages and 5 pages. If it is under 3 pages, very often the person has not given me enough detail. They have not gone through and explained exactly what they mean in such a way that anyone could understand each step of it. If they've gone over 5 pages, it's usually because they are repeating themselves or including things that are not directly tied in with the prompt. And this is going to bring me into another one in a second, is stay on target. I'll get to that in a second. But what I will say is it is not a guarantee if a paper is under 3 pages or over 5 pages that it is not a good paper. I have gotten papers that barely made it to 2 pages and yet were an incredibly well-structured, clear, easy to follow argument. And it's just that the person was very good at saying a lot in few words. I've also had papers where a person didn't have anything they didn't need. It was 10 pages long, but every one of those 10 pages was contributing something to the argument. I will never take off points on length simply because it's either shorter or longer than the suggestion. So if you write a paper that's only 2 pages and then you get to 3 pages with a bibliography, if you think that the argument is sufficient enough to get your point across, that is enough paper. In theory, if you were a genius who could somehow make a perfect argument in only a single word, there's the perfect word, you can invent it yourself and it would clearly get your argument across, and I could understand exactly what you meant, I would not take off points for that one word. However, the reason why I give these suggestions is it's going to be almost impossible to write a very good paper in 1 word. In fact, in that case, it would be impossible. Likewise, it's very hard to write a good paper in under 3 pages. And it's very often the case that if you go over 5, it's too long. And because you are simply repeating yourself or not staying on target. However, do not take those word numbers, those page numbers. There are professors who will encourage you to really learn those deadlines. You'll have plenty of time to really learn word numbers, page numbers. This class, I want to focus on the arguments. So if you go under or over the numbers, do not stress about it. Does that make sense? And does that answer your question, Valerie?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I just really want to stress that because I don't want you all stressing over the page limits too much. You should be worried about the quality of your argument, not whether you have to, like, put a bunch of hidden words in white font so you reach the word number. No, don't bother wasting your effort with that. All right, so that's going to lead to stay on target. In an argument like this, you have a specific claim you're trying to defend. What that means is you don't have to say every single thing you know about a topic. Think about it this way. If you were just trying to convince your friend that pineapple shouldn't go on pizza, you're not going to tell them every single fact you've ever learned about pineapple. That's irrelevant to the point. If you're trying to explain to someone why it is that they should become a vegetarian, you're not going to have to explain the history of the word vegetarian or list off great famous vegetarians through history. You're going to want to stay focused on the topic. So in a paper like this, if you're talking about cultural relativism, describe enough that I know what cultural relativism is. You don't have to tell me every single fact about it, like that your great-grandmother was a cultural relativist. If you're doing the prompt on the trolley problem, if it's relevant to your topic, you can bring up that your favorite show is The Good Place and that you saw the trolley problem for the first time there. But if it's not directly playing a role in your paper, you don't have to bring that up. You also don't have to tell me about, if you do mention it, don't then bring up that Kristen Bell is your favorite actress and that she really likes sloths. None of that is directly relevant to your paper. So stay on target. Remind yourself what the goal is that you're talking about. Don't tell me everything. Same thing with the free speech one. If you argue that we need to reduce free speech in order to prevent hate speech, and one of the reasons is hate speech can lead to problems, you can give the example of something like the Capitol riots, but don't then tell me the life history of the guy who stole the podium from the Capitol. I don't need to know that level of detail. Does that make sense? So you want to give enough detail that your reader knows what you're talking about, but not so much detail that the reader's lost in the weeds and doesn't actually get it. It becomes hard to identify the good stuff because there's so much extraneous, unnecessary information. And so this is where the real tough part of writing a paper comes in, is you need to explain each idea clearly enough that anyone could understand it, but not in so much irrelevant detail that it's going to confuse or detract. And this is where you really have to put yourself in the mind of your reader. It's not just, is what I'm saying true? It's, what would that person have to hear so that their mind would be able to identify what my mind wants them to think? All that makes sense? And again, writing is not something that comes naturally to any human. It is tough and it takes practice. And the goal of this is to improve, not to necessarily, like, how well this paper turns out is far less important than whether you feel you got something out of it at the end. All right. So that's the next point, the stay on target. Any other questions on that? Or anything else about the papers thus far? I've got about 3 more things I want to discuss. Or I guess 4 more things, but all right. Okay. What number are we up to? 7 quotes. All right. Quotes. You don't need them, but if you're going to get them, if you've got them, you've got to paraphrase them. So what all does that mean? Well, first off, what is it to paraphrase something?
A shortened version?
Shortened version in your own words. So basically what that means is if you include a quote, don't just assume that the reader's going to know what it means. Instead, put it in your own words. And this is especially important in a paper like this because including quotes nowadays, how hard is it to include a quote? Well, it involves 2 fingers. It involves Control C, and then you move it to the Control V. A cat can Control C, Control V. A dog can Control C, Control V. That does not show that you have necessarily understood the material. Rather, what shows you've understood the material is once you take this Control C, Control V thing, you then put it in your own words and explain how it fits in with your overall argument. So for instance, if you're trying to argue that, imagine that your a thesis you're trying to argue for is something like Abraham Lincoln was the greatest speechwriter in American history. And in the process of doing this, you use, or let's go with a better one. Biggie is the greatest rapper of all time. And your evidence for that is Biggie's lyrics are spectacular. Well, if you were arguing that paper, you'd want to include some of Biggie's lyrics. And you'd want to explain why what he's saying is so genius. So if you include a line from a Biggie song, then you say, this is an incredibly clever line because he's expressing the idea that yada yada while using these other words. That's what I mean by paraphrasing the quotes and explaining what their significance is. So does that make sense to everybody about how you would not just include the quote, but then give it in your own words so that I, the teacher, know that you understand it and that the reader would be able to understand what exactly it means? We
So,
good on that?
so Professor, for the quotes, we're obviously using quotations if needed, and then we paraphrase and then explain what we're saying, right?
Basically, yes. Which is, I mean, again, it's basically how much you need to paraphrase and how much you need to explain is going to change from quote to quote. But that is a general good approach, what you just described, which also ties in with the next thing I want to say, which is best way of putting this. Don't be afraid to use phrases like, by this, I mean, or the significance of this is. These sorts of phrases are very useful. So after you've explained a quote, if you've given a quote, you've paraphrased it, or after you've included an example and you've explained what it means, doing that by saying, by this I mean that, or the significance of this story is that. Don't leave it for your reader to connect the dots. Assume they are such an idiot that you need to tell them what to think. Always tell someone what to think. Do not just ask them to figure it out on their own. So another thing is tell, don't ask. So don't, a classic thing which many people fall into is to end a paragraph or end a thought with a question. A question like, well, you wouldn't like it if somebody broke into your house, would you? That right there is not nearly as effective as just telling somebody the reason why they wouldn't want someone to break into the house. A stupid reader might not realize, they might think like, oh, I love it when people break into my house. I like strangers, I like meeting new people. I don't care, I don't believe in personal property. What you have to do is explain to them like, the reason it's bad when people have access to your house is that they have the possibility of causing you physical harm. So does that difference make sense? Don't just ask the question, force feed me what to think. So if your paragraph is designed to say something like, dogs are better than cats because they are friendlier, or cultural relativism is a flawed theory because it has consequence X, then don't just say, that wouldn't be a good idea, would it? Or nobody would like this consequence of cultural relativism. No, tell me exactly what that consequence is. Tell me why it's a problem and explain to me why I should be on board and think that problem's a big deal. It's about connecting the dots and forcing your reader to understand why your main thesis that you are arguing for is the right thing to believe at the end of the day. We good?
Yes.
Okay. So that takes us up to 9. Tell, don't ask. Which brings us up to 10. Can I have define your terms? I brought this up last week, but basically, if you're talking about in a philosophy paper about a complex idea or a key topic, you can't just assume the reader knows exactly what it is, even if it's something that we use in our everyday life. So for instance, free speech. Free speech gets used in multiple different ways. So what you are going to want to do in your paper is, if you're going to be talking about free speech, include a definition of free speech. And don't just define it. Make sure your definition is substantive enough that the reader would be able to understand what you're talking about from that definition. Don't be afraid to include a few different sentences that contribute to it, or an example. So say free speech by definition is blah, blah, blah. An example of free speech would be yada, yada, yada. This counts as free speech because. That's the level of detail we're really looking for here to really hammer it home. All right. Those are the main tips I really want to hammer home about the paper writing process. A thing you should always try to do is put yourself in the shoes of the imagined reader. Don't just think about throwing your ideas out there. Slow down and think, what would a reader think if they read this sentence? And really try to be just take it slow, take it relaxed, and ask, what would I have to do to ensure that the reader knows what I'm talking about? Now, last few things I have are practical issues around the papers. So I'm just going to put up practical points. But before I start going through these, are there any more questions on any of the things I just talked about, or want me to go through examples of what I mean by these things, or anything along these lines? Does anyone have any sort of questions about anything thus far? All right, so the other practical points. We've already done the page numbers, or the number of pages one, and I've done the citation ones. Spelling. Don't care much. I say spelling don't care much. The ultimate goal of your paper is to make it clear to me what you're talking about. So long as I'm able to figure out what you're talking about, I will not take off points for spelling, punctuation, grammar. If you say you're right instead of you're right, well, you're going to want at some point to learn how to write in this way, simply because we live in a very judgy world where if you, in a fancy email, spell it that way, people aren't going to take you seriously. However, right now, I want you focused. I know a lot of you English isn't your first language. I want you to focus right now on the argumentative stuff. Your spelling alone is never going to make you a great writer. So you can practice that at other times in other ways. This class and the skill we're trying to learn here is forming cohesive, strong arguments, practicing having a single train of thought run through an entire paper, making everything work towards a single argumentative goal. So if you're able to do that with spelling that is not ideal, I do not care about the spelling or the punctuation. I just need to know what you're trying to say. Which also leads into spelling, punctuation. Little words are good. The topics we're talking about are complicated. Cultural relativism, even what it is not entirely agreed upon. Whether something counts as a cultural relativist view isn't super clear. Where the line between hate speech and non-hate speech, not always clear. So if the topics are complicated, don't make things tougher on yourself or your reader by using big words. Instead of saying something like these constitutional deficiencies, just say these legal problems. The smaller words are better. Instead of using big fancy terms, just keep it simple, make it easy for me to understand, and make it easier on yourself. You can get by with short, nice words, short sentences, whatever it is that just makes it easier to follow along with. Lastly, along with little words, I know I said it last time, I is your friend. You're allowed to say something as explicit as, in this next paragraph, I will argue that. Or, my goal now is to argue that. You're allowed to be a part of this paper. It is your argument. You are the one making your point clear. So I, my, me, all allowed. That's the last of the practical points. Are there any other questions at this point that anybody has about papers, how to approach it, anything like that? All right. In that case, if nobody has any questions, I'm going to put up the last of, we're just basically going to run back over what we've talked about already in class. So, pop quiz / whatever, when's the paper due?
Next week,
Yep, when next week?
24th, Monday, by end of day.
24th, end of day. That's Monday. That will give me enough time to grade and comment on the papers before the 28th when grades are due. So, end of day on the 24th. If leading up to the 24th, you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out. I will be checking email. I will be happy to give you any help you need on the paper writing process. If you want to schedule a meeting to talk to me, just reach out. If you're like, hey, professor, I need to meet in 5 minutes time, I might not be able to make it work. But I have a mostly flexible schedule during the finals lead up week. So just reach out to me. I can help you with any questions you have. As I said, today is our last class, so you do not have, you can forget this Zoom link forever. All that you have left now is just to finish this paper. If at any point in the semester there was some work that was due and you have not turned in yet, if you turn it in now, you can still get partial credit on it. Just make sure to email me to let me know that you turned it in. I will try when I'm doing the final grades to go through and look for anything that, so like if there's a blank space in my grade book, I will look to see if there's something corresponding to that blank space online, posted to the Blackboard or in my email. But just to play it safe, I can always make mistakes. Reach out and let me know. I want to be able to give you all credit for late work or anything I missed at the time. So just reach out, let me know. You'll be getting back the signpost / outline assignments with a bunch of little feedback and things tomorrow morning. So if you haven't turned it in yet, get it to me as soon as you can. Any other questions, comments, concerns on anything at all? That is all I really wanted to discuss today, unless there's anything you all want to ask me about or share with me or anything else. Any other questions on anything at this point? All right, in that case, all I'm going to say is best of luck with finals. Thank you all for being a great audience all semester. Hopefully you all learned something. Hopefully at least some of it was interesting. If you've got, feel free to stay in touch if there's anything that comes up. If you have any questions about anything in the last couple of weeks or work or what your grade is looking like, all of that, just reach out to me. I am around. I will be checking email. Thank you all for being great all semester. And I hope to see a lot of you again in the future.
Thanks, Professor.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
Professor.
Thank
Have a
you,
great-
Professor. Thank
Good
you,
luck with all your
Professor.
finals, everyone.
Bye.